Anyway, so please, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together. People.
I have to say, first of all, that when I stood for the presidency, I wasn't standing on a BNP ticket. It was nothing to do with politics at all, but very much to do with problems in my profession and the way the institute was run. Just want to make that quite clear. But obviously it had some impact when it was released. 2 or 3 months ago, I gave a talk to Basingstoke branch about the state of the economy. And those are 3 of the charts that I dealt with there. I'm not going to go through those now, but just to show you that on the left-hand side is the current national debt, which I think, I can't see it here, is 890 billion. That was 2 months ago, so it's more than that now. The smaller leaflet on the far right-hand side is the deficit each year. And currently it's about 170 billion, so that's being added to the debt each year. And that's the thing that Mr Osborne's trying to get down. And then the one in the middle is just where the money goes, the expenditure that comes in, where it goes. But what I want to do now is to talk about the sort of policies that a nationalist government would need to instigate if and when it ever gains power. And I think if we do gain power, I think that by then the state of the country would be even worse than it is now. And that's difficult to imagine. I think there'd be lawlessness, more lawlessness than there is now. There will be mass unemployment, which I tried to demonstrate last week. The housing crisis will be even worse than it is now, because there will be another 500,000 people coming, a net 250,000 people coming in each year. We'll have an even more fractured society with no commonality between us. And I think ultimately we might even get a bit of indigenous resentment. British people take an awful lot to get agitated. We're well known for being reserved, and we put up with things. But once young people can't get jobs, once they're being disadvantaged, right, left and centre, they're being discriminated against, then maybe eventually the penny will drop. And I'm sure that's going to happen. So a BNP government or a nationalist government, if it ever takes power, is going to have a country that's in an absolute dreadful state. So what do we do? Well, the first thing we need to do in the first week is we need to stop immigration, pass whatever laws are necessary, what have you. Tell the EU, you can go and stuff your policies, we're not letting any more people in. Okay? We need to start to initiate the process of leaving the European Union. We wouldn't be able to leave overnight. I would think it needs to be done as quickly as possible, maybe in 2 or 3 months, because the longer it drags out, the more the uncertainty is, and the more adverse impact that would have on our economy, what's left of it. Third thing we need to do is to initiate proceedings to eliminate the delaying powers of the House of Lords, because I think what would happen when our government takes power is that the Lords will try to delay everything we try to do for the first 12 months. That's what they're able to do, for everything except finance. So we need to start initiating the process of clipping the Lords' powers. In my view, we ought to abolish the Lords, but that's something, it's a subject on its own. And if it's necessary to if we need to clip the Lords' powers straight away, then we need to appoint a large number of BNP or nationalist members to outvote the existing House of Lords, because we can't wait 12 months for some of these things to be done. Next thing we need to do is to abolish the Human Rights Act. I won't go into any more detail about that, because we all know what's wrong with the Rights Act. If it had been a Human Rights and Responsibilities Act, it wouldn't have been quite so bad. I still wouldn't have agreed with it, but there you go. And then finally, these are the priority things to do in the first week of power. We need to get rid of particularly the Race Amendment Act of 2000. Now, I don't know whether you know, how many people know that contrary to 1,000 years of English law, where you're assumed innocent until you're proven guilty. This Act says that if someone accuses you of a racially motivated act, or thought even, you are guilty and you have to prove yourself innocent. Now, it's very difficult to prove a negative anyway, but to prove a negative thought is almost impossible. But that's what that Act says. It's a wicked Act. And you can get up to 7 years imprisonment for it. One of our members a few years ago got 2.5 years, no remission, no parole, for a minor infringement, and it was only words, not deeds, as far as I understand. That's how vicious that Act is. Now, the most important, apart from the unfairness of it, the most important reason why that Act has got to be repealed is because it has undermined anyone in authority. The police are dead scared of dealing with ethnic minorities because they could be out of a job, out of a pension almost immediately, because they're going to be assumed to be the guilty party. And it's not just police, it's anyone. It's planning enforcement officers to stop this sort of thing. Are you all familiar with it? I don't know if you can see this. It was in the paper 6 days ago. All these backland developments, totally as rented accommodation, totally against the law. So, if you're an enforcement officer, would you make an issue of that? No, you wouldn't, because you'd be accused of racism. So that Act, I think, has been the most damaging thing to our society, and it's been in existence for 11 years. In fact, it's the Act that made me join the BNP, because I was so angry with it, and I could see where it was going to lead. So that's the first week. We need to start those things. Now, what are the other priorities going to be? The sort of longer-term priorities. Well, I think probably the next most important is to restore some semblance of lawfulness in this country, law and order. Because if you don't have a society that has a modicum of lawfulness, then society just doesn't work. And we can all see how it's getting worse and worse and worse. I don't know whether you realise that the criminality is more than 10 times what it was in the 1950s. Now, okay, we have a larger population now than we did then, but not significantly so. And as far as violent crime is concerned, it's 15 times what it was in the 1950s. And I think it's partly because I don't think you can blame that entirely on immigration and a fractured society, but it's certainly a factor. And so it's also widespread low-level lawlessness, sort of troublemakers in the streets who get ASBOs, which they regard as a badge of honour these days. It's all sorts of lawlessness. It's this sort of lawlessness as well. I call that sort of low-level law. It's not murder, is it? But it's everywhere. And of course, this has a tremendous cost. The cost of the police presumably there are 10 times the number of police than there were in the 1950s. That costs us a lot of money. It's costing society a lot. Now, I think. So what are we going to do about it? Well, if we had Sharia law in this country, heaven forbid it ever happens, but you never know these days. If we had Sharia law in this country, if you steal something, you get your hand chopped off. Now, what effect do you think that would have on theft? I think it would be a disinducement, to say the least. So that's one extreme, and I'm certainly not advocating that sort of thing. But the extreme we have in this country is liberalism, which has resulted in soft sentencing. So there is no punishment, or it's, most people, this lot will get away with it. So why do they need to bother? And so somewhere between those two extremes, the liberalism we've got today and Sharia law, there must be a level of punishment and deterrent that will stop most people from carrying out acts of criminality. That will bring lawlessness down, and we can have less police. It'll cost us less, so we can spend that money on other things, or we can keep some of it. So what do we need to do with the sentences? Well, I think generally a lot of the sentences that are on the statute book are adequate. The trouble is, when you take a third off for remission, a third off for parole, they only get a third of their sentence, and that's totally inadequate. So what I would do is get rid of parole, get rid of remission, and if they misbehave themselves in prison, they get extra. Now, I think that would, if you want to empty the prisons or reduce the prison population, you won't doing it, as Ken Clark seems to think, by softening sentences and, preventing people from going to prison. You make it so damned likely that you will go to prison for quite a considerable time, you'll think twice about the risk. That's not going to stop everyone going, but it'll certainly do something. I think there also needs to be more consistent guidelines at the moment, because at the moment it seems to depend on what judge you're lucky or unlucky enough to get determined. There needs to be more consistency about that, and maybe there should be a commission that approved by Parliament, because at the moment I think sentencing is decided by the legal profession. Well, that doesn't seem right to me. Who voted for them? I think there needs to be more scrutiny of the judiciary, so that when you get these rogue judges, these wishy-washy judges, producing very questionable, one after another, questionable judgments, then I think there ought to be a commission that actually looks at them and sees whether they're fit to carry on their job. It's all part of the consistency. I think there needs to be reform of community sentences. I'm not against community sentence for minor infringements, for youngsters who've got a bit out of hand, need to learn a lesson. But they need to do useful jobs. I wrote a letter to my local paper 2 or 3 weeks ago pointing out what a dreadful state the town where I live, Redhill, is. It's so run down, it's filthy dirty, there's gum all over the place, there's litter all over the place, and which the council doesn't help. No, I think that's the sort of thing that community centres, let them do it, and let them do it in orange jumper shoots so that we can see them, so that, they're not just hidden away, just doing a few hours helping to improve some old lady's garden. And then there's corporal punishment, and these are all, certainly corporal punishment is part of the BNP policy, I fully agree with it, for really wicked or persistent crimes. And finally, capital punishment. Now, I know there's not everyone agrees with this, but our policy on capital punishment, and I think it's absolutely right, is that the death penalty applies for premeditated murder where it can be proved beyond any doubt. Now, the level of proof that's required for criminal law in this country, and most Anglo-Saxon countries, is that it's got to be beyond reasonable doubt. Well, if you're going to take someone's life away, it's got to be without any doubt, either they're caught in the act or DNA evidence to prove it. And if someone's found guilty of premeditated murder, but it's only beyond reasonable doubt, then it should be what it is now, the life sentence, but it should mean life. It shouldn't mean 12 years plus, which it can do. It should mean life. If you take someone's life deliberately, you should forfeit your own life, if not actually, physically forfeiting it. That's BNP policy, and I totally agree with it. The next major problem we've got to deal with is immigration. Well, England is now the most densely populated, and I would say overpopulated country in Europe. It's the 4th most densely populated country in the world, if you exclude the few city-states like Singapore and Hong Kong. And so the idea that we should have any more people coming to this country is absolute madness. We must stop it. Now, at the rate immigration is going on at the moment, it's about 250,000, net 250,000 a year coming here and staying here, even though we don't have houses for them, of course. By 2030, I read recently, 2030, babies born in this country, the majority will be from ethnic minorities, okay? And by 2050, only 20 years later, we will all be a minority in our own country. Now, if we don't do something about immigration, and do it damn quickly, that's the fate that's in store for us. Now, Cameron, just before the local elections, surprise, surprise, a bit like Maggie there, he made some promises on immigration. You can always tell when there's an election coming up, when the Tories start talking about immigration, then as soon as the election's over, they forget about it. And he said, oh, we're going to, definitely going to cut immigration down to, I think he said, low levels, believe you. But let's point out one or two things about why he can't deliver. Well, while we're in the EU, currently we've got a net immigration from the EU of 200,000 people. So that's 200,000 that he's ignored. At the moment, work permits, there are 500,000 work permits, 500,000 work permits granted every year. A lot of those people will stay. And the Tory party has decided to reduce it to 230,000. That's not exactly a small number in my mind. Then you've got arranged marriages, 150,000. Now, one of the first things that the Labour Party did when it came to power in 1997, and certainly wasn't in its manifesto, they abolished something called the primary purpose rule. And this was a rule that was intended to prevent, if you like, marriage's convenience, because you have arranged marriages in the Asian subcontinent, and this was a way of just having, instead of marrying amongst their own people here, importing extra people. And I think it was the previous Tory party that brought the primary purpose rule in. First thing the Labour Party did when it came into power was to abolish that rule. And immigration went up from, it was 50,000 a year, had been for a few years prior to them coming in, and the following year it was 150,000. So that's the Labour Party for you. Now, have you heard Cameron say that he's going to reintroduce that primary purpose rule? Anyone heard him say that? No, I haven't either. So that's another 130. Then you've got student visas. Right. Well, they were, until last year, 500,000. And the Tories are going to slash it to 400,000. And we know that, of course, a lot of them are bogus students. They're not students at all, or they overstay. They just disappear, like that fellow that got killed in the Portuguese fellow got killed on the tube train. He was someone who'd overstayed his visa. And as it happens, the year before Labour came to power, student visas were only 198,000. Well, even that was too many in my view. Then you've got the illegal and bogus ones. Has he said what he's going to do to get rid of those? How many are they? It could be 1 million, could be 2 million. There's no attempt made to try and find out what they are, certainly to deport them, because any government officer or a civil servant tasked with the job, the border agency, that's a bit of a laugh, isn't it? Border and Customs Agency, is that what it's called? It's such a joke. Can you imagine any of those robustly dealing with illegal immigrants? No, they won't, because they'll be accused of racism under the Race Relations Act. They'll lose their job. And then, of course, finally, you've got the Human Rights Act, which means that we can't deport criminals or immigrant criminals or terrorists. So that's why Cameron was being completely disingenuous when he said he was going to really reduce immigration to low levels. So let's go back to where we are now. That's immigration. The EU, we need to leave the EU. And hopefully within 3 months of taking power we'll have done it, because it's unaccountable, it's corrupt, it's unnecessary, and it's very expensive. It actually costs us a net 10 billion a year. Well, that's a good start to reducing that to 170 billion that our current deficit is, isn't it? That's a useful amount. You've then got the Common Agricultural Policy, which makes us pay more for food than we would otherwise need to do. Most importantly, it means that we can't control any immigration from anywhere in the EU, which now consists of, am I right, it's 27 states now? Some of which are very poor, and so there's a big incentive for them to come here. We can't control that because of the EU. That's probably the more important reason why we need to get it out of the EU, or there are several. Now, some people might say, oh gosh, all those countries on the continent, they'll all gang up on us, and we won't be able to sell our manufactured goods anymore. What manufactured goods we still produce, of course. But you've only got to look at Norway and Switzerland, who have a sort of detached status from the EU, not EU members, but they have effectively the same advantages, same trading conditions as us, but they don't have to abide by the other stupid EU rules and bureaucracy that we have to endure. So that's why we need to leave the EU. Then we've got the economy. Now, last time I was there, I was just giving the state of the financial state of the economy, and we need to do something about it. George Osborne's trying to do something about it, but I'm not so sure he's going to succeed, or not as much as he thinks he's going to, and how much we need to. But we've got to eliminate that deficit. That's the shortfall of money that we earn every year. I'm talking about government debt, not personal debt, which is also a problem. We've got to have a surplus, because we've got to pay, we owe at the moment over £900 billion, and we've got to pay that money back. Because if we don't, we'll be paying interest on it. And at the moment, interest rates for government bonds, which is how you borrow this money, are actually quite low. But if the markets start to get jittery, if if the economy doesn't grow a little bit and don't manage to reduce that deficit, suddenly those interest rates will go up. And at the moment, 6% of the money that we're paying to the government goes in paying interest. That could very easily double overnight. And that 6% is more than our defence budget. Do you see it's the red line in the middle poster there? That's 6% of what our expenditure. So we must reduce the deficit, which will then reduce the debt. Now our economy is very unbalanced. It has been unbalanced for 20 or 30 years, in that we rely on a very successful finance industry, the banks. Oh, don't we love them all? We rely on them to earn a tremendous amount of money to pay taxes. And in actual fact, to a certain extent, the money that we earn from finance, invisibles they're called, balances our balance of payments. You know, the money that we're spending on imports versus the money we're receiving on exports. They make up the difference. But the trouble is, you end up with a very small number of people earning fantastic amounts of money with their £1 million bonuses a year and what have you. And then a large number of people who are unemployed or underemployed or working on low wages, who have no real stake in the country. Is it any wonder that these people are starting to riot? And I think we've only just seen the start of it. So we've got a very unbalanced economy. And one of the things that we need to do is to revive our manufacturing industry, because it's been hemorrhaged, and you can't just blame Labour for that. It's the Tories as well. It's been going on for 40 years. Look how this government reacted when Cadbury's was sold to Kraft. You know, oh, it's such a shame, but did they do anything about it? Like heck they did. And it's the same with the rolling stock for the, Crossrail, I think it was going to be, that it went to German Siemens instead of Bombardier. Not in Bombardier in Derby. Not that Bombardier is British. It isn't. It's a sort of international, it's a Canadian company, I think. But at least if they're going to be manufactured here. Now, France and Germany, they fiddle the rules. They don't play by this the sort of globalist free trade rules. You know, they massage the way in which procurement goes on. So the French, I think, apart from about 10 carriages, they've never ever bought rolling stock from any other country, and that's why they have a very successful train manufacturing industry. Likewise, Germany. I don't think Germany is quite so brazen in the way that it does it, but it certainly does it. And of course, German manufacturing is very good in trains. Another thing is that partly because of this the imbalance in the economy, we're getting a widening income gap. So you're getting these very, very rich people, you're getting, frankly, grossly overpaid senior public servants and local government officers earning just absurd amounts of money and pensions to go with it. And then there's people in the middle like me who've been all right, but not fantastic. And then there's a large number of people who are living on the borderline, absolute borderline. And is it any wonder that they lose heart? I'm sure when we've been leafleting and canvassing, we've been around some estates, and they just look so sad and desperate, Unfortunately, these people have lost all interest, and they tend not to vote for anyone, let alone us. We need to get rid of the Anglo-Saxon laissez-faire system. We believe in globalism, Throughout the last 2 centuries, there's always been, particularly in the Victorian times, there's great arguments about whether we have free trade or don't have, or we have protectionism. And we've usually gone along free trade. And if you look at most Anglo-Saxon countries, they believe in globalism. They believe in free trade and what have you. But other countries don't. Japan doesn't. France doesn't. And I can be damn sure that China and Taiwan, that they don't do it either. They have protectionism. And we need to wake up to what's going on to do the same. Now, I'll come on to that in a minute. But we can't just put up barriers for our industry to be feather-bedded, what industry we've got. It's got to be just enough to help them to start growing again, or to re-emerge, because most of them have disappeared. So we've got to be, whatever policy we do, as with these other very successful economies, we must improve our efficiency, because we've still got to trade. We can't be isolationists. We need energy, we need food, because we're so overpopulated. So we've got to earn our way. We can't afford to be isolationist. I was going to go on some of the fiscal savings. I remember I stood in Windsor in the general election, and I was lucky enough to attend 3 hustings meetings, because usually we're banned. They usually won't invite us, but 2 churches and 1 school, I was invited along. The Green candidate came to, it's a full slate of candidates and 1 independent, and the Green candidate came to the first one, and he happened to be the last to give his introductory speech, and tieless and jacketless, he sort of sauntered up to the microphone. He was last. We'd all given our little 1-minute introduction, and we'd all received polite applause, me included. But the Green candidate saunters up to the microphone, says he's not going to share a platform with nasty fascists or something like that, and walks off. And he walked off to stony silence. I'm sure he expected a rapturous applause. Well, he didn't get it. And on the other 2 occasions, he chose not to share the platform with me, which is rather silly. I think I would have made mincemeat of him, or at least their policies anyway. However, we were asked at one stage about how we would make savings, but we didn't have long enough an opportunity to go into a little bit of detail. But I had jotted down when I was at the meeting the savings that was good. Oh, that's right. Yes, in the last one, there was the Tory candidate at the end, the incumbent. We're going to reduce the deficit. That's the annual amount. That's the small thing over there. We're going to reduce it by 12 billion a year. Okay. Labour one says we're going to reduce it by 6 billion a year. And the Liberal one to the left of me said, well, we're going to reduce it by 10 billion a year, because we don't want to if we do too much, it'll spoil the economy and what have you. Unfortunately, I was 4th, not 1st. And I said, well, there you have it. Tweedledum, Tweedledee, and Tweedle in between. 12 billion, 6 billion, and 10 billion. And I said, these are piddling amounts of money. I don't think that then anyone really had an idea, none of the other candidates, that we're 170 billion per year in deficit. So that sort of money is not going to make any difference at all. I didn't have an opportunity of saying at the time the sort of savings that I would make, but I'll just tell you what they are. Climate change. This nonsense climate change bill that's going to go onto our energy bills, 18 billion a year. Immigration, Migration Watch reckons that that's 13 billion a year. The asylum racket, that probably costs about 4 billion a year, all the subsidies and support we have to give them. EU membership, I've just mentioned that, that's 10 billion a year net. EU regulation, well, the taxpayers, that's all the stupid rules and regulations we have to abide by. The Taxpayers Alliance reckons that's 118 billion a year. I mean, there's obviously a certain amount of guesswork here. Foreign aid, well, that we know is going to be 13 billion this year, because Tweedledum, Tweedledee and Tweedle in between all said we're going to increase the foreign aid budget to 13 billion. They all said the exact, so they must have agreed it between them. That's why they're one party. It's a demonstration of it. That's up from 9 billion last year, so I'd get rid of that, most of it. I actually started my career as a VSO volunteer in Kenya for 2 years. Fabulous start to my career. I really enjoyed it. It was a very interesting country. But I was aware of the corruption and the waste from aid. I think my little effort was a waste, really, but I enjoyed it, so what the hell. So I think probably we should allow 1 billion to help out with emergencies, droughts and floods and what have you, whenever they occur. But we could certainly get rid of the rest. Quangos, probably about, you know what quangos are? All these non-government organisations. Some of them you can't get rid of because they're actually performing functions that have, if they weren't performed by quangos, they'd have to be performed by government, which is probably better if they did. But they're 10 billion a year. And then you've got 5 billion a year for the Afghan war. Well, that's 191 billion. Well, we'd have a bit of a surplus if we did some of these things. We wouldn't have to be going through the agony that Osborne is putting us through now. But unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to mention that. So that's the economy. How am I doing for time? Then we need to, the most important thing is we've got to revive our industry, recreate it in many cases, in a way that, it could be very good because we'd be almost starting from afresh. The factories would be new, the processes would be new and up to date, if we take advantage of that. But we've got to reverse the trade deficit we have in manufactured goods, which is absolutely appalling, partly because I think we can't rely on finance, even if we wanted to earn as much money as it has. Because do you think the Chinese... What's finance? It's making a lot of money by shuffling money around, isn't it, basically? I mean, it's an essential function, but that's what it is. Do you think the Chinese are going to be happy with us making all this easy money and them not? No, they're not, and I believe they're already giving mortgages and what have you. So, we've got to build up our industry. I've said that we need to produce protective tariffs, but only enough to help the businesses get established. They mustn't be feather-bedded, and they must be competitive. So I wouldn't be giving grants for factories and equipment and what have you, but I would improve the infrastructure to industrial estates and factories. We have one of the worst transport systems. I think we have by far the worst transport network infrastructure in Europe. Railways, but particularly the roads. The roads need a vast improvement, and our planning system needs to help establish new industrial sites or clear away the old ones. And if and when taxes can be lowered, if we get this balance right, my view is the first priority has got to be to reduce corporation tax and taxes on business, because we've got to make them competitive, because we are competing with a lot of pretty good economies out there, and that's where I think the priority. It shouldn't go into consumption for us, because what we will do at the moment is just buy more imports. We've got to build our industry first, and then we can start buying products from ourselves. Now, probably the most important thing, I think, is returning our country to personal responsibility and a decent work ethic. I'll come on to the work ethic in a minute. We've got a welfare state. I mean, it's developed since about the 1911 when pensions were first introduced, and it's developed since then. And it was done for very good reasons. But it's now got so distorted that almost everyone is reliant on it. We're not self-reliant. There's a staggering figure I read not long ago that 1/3 of families in this country have half their income from benefits, not from their own work. that increases this reliance on the state, the feeling that you've got to take whatever state handouts there are. I think it reduces self-respect, particularly for those really at the bottom of the rung. And of course also, it distorts your decision-making. If you're in this vision, it distorts your decision-making. If you're on benefits where you don't have... I'll just give you one example. If you're on benefits where you don't have to pay council tax because the government pays it, so you never see... you just don't have to pay it, and you don't have to pay rent. But if you don't have to pay that, what incentive is there for you to not vote for a profligate Labour council? None whatsoever. Now, when people have benefits, and I recognise that, I think a lot of people have got to come off benefit. You've got to change the system. I'll deal with that in a minute. But when people are on benefits, I think they should be actually paid the average council tax in the country. That should be part of their benefit. If they're unreliable payers, then maybe that would have to be paid directly at source by the Inland Revenue. But they should be paid it. And then, if they vote for a profligate Labour Party that's going to put up their council tax, they're going to lose some of that benefit. So there's an incentive, just even within the benefit system, of actually encouraging people to think about how the people that they vote for. Now, wages. We all know that particularly at the bottom end of the market, particularly the unskilled, but increasingly semi-skilled, even my profession is under threat from outsourcing overseas. I'm sure that's I work for myself, so I'm not quite sure what salary is at the moment. But it's quite clear that wages are being kept low by mass immigration, particularly for manual labour, and kept barely above the minimum wage level. I think if we didn't have a minimum wage, we'd be having people on extremely low wages. I bet you find most of the people in these little dwellings here are on minimum wages, if that. And of course, this suits a lot of employers, isn't it? Because it's cheap labour, it's easily manual. It's a good thing to do. So it actually discourages industries and businesses to be more efficient. Now, if they didn't have that source of cheap labour, they would have to be more efficient. They'd have to be more careful about who they employ, how many people they employ. And we'd be working towards what we should have, which is a high-wage economy. There's no way that we are a high-wage economy now in comparison to most of our European neighbours. We're a low-wage, we're skivvies, and that's our own fault. So we need to discourage it. Now you've got to ask the question, you hear people who living in a nice house in, I don't know, West London somewhere, Fulham. They're saying, well, foreigners are willing to do the work. Our people aren't willing to do the work. So, they're just lazy. Well, why are foreigners willing to do the work? Well, the money that they earn here is probably worth 4 or 5 times as much when they take it to their families, when they, send it to their families back home. So if you are able to earn 4 or 5 times as much as you're earning now, wouldn't you be prepared to do things you wouldn't otherwise do? That's why they're prepared to do it. That's one of the reasons they're prepared to do it. And of course, then, also in answer to this question that people who are well-heeled will say, is that, why aren't Brits doing it? Well, Brits can't afford to do it because you can't live on the minimum wage. Even a single person can't live on the minimum wage. It's impossible. Not in this country you can. If your family's in Poland or Latvia or something, that's fine, bit of hardship and you can live. So that's one of the reasons. However, I think we as Britons have to face up to a few home truths. I think, how do foreigners see us? Well, I was in the pub the other day and this fellow sort of joined the conversation I was having with a friend of mine, and he was a little bit worse for wear, but not too much. You could still do. And he was going on about he'd been here he's Polish, and he'd been here for X number of years and what have you. And then after about 10 minutes, when he thought, we were all chums and what have you, he said, but I think Britain can't do without immigrants. You couldn't do without us. And I was livid. I said, that's it, I've had enough of this, and I walked out. Because it might have ended up in a rather heated discussion in a pub, which isn't a good idea. That's how a lot of foreigners think of us. At one of the hustings meetings I attended, there was a lady there, said very sort of gingerly, because there was a bit of controversy about a local hospital at the time. She said very gingerly, one of the problems with the hospital is that there are so many immigrant nurses there, they all speak different languages. And she said, again, even more nervously, and I think so many of them just look down on us. They despise us, and it's seen in their mannerism. Now, I've been in hospital last couple of years on 2 occasions for minor operations. I didn't come across that, but I certainly did sense this lack of cohesion and perhaps, a feeling. I mean, you can understand it. They've come from a deprived country, years of communism, what have you. They come to our country, see us, we're lapping it all up, and they think we're lazy lot. You can understand why they'd be a little bit resentful of us. And I think that may be one of the reasons why we are learning about, uncaring attitudes of nurses, some nurses, and particularly in old people's homes, where all the people are working on low incomes, and you'll find a large number of them are these foreigners because, the Brits won't do it. So we do have this reputation of being lazy and a bit fickle. And I think we have to face up to the fact that to a certain extent we are. And if we don't address that, I'm afraid that the rest of the world's not going to thank us for it. We'll just be sidelined. We've got to address that. Now, I've got a contractor, he's just finished a job for me, a small contractor, and he was employing Lithuanians. No, they weren't. They were Albanians, that's right, Albanians, and I think 1 Pole. And I think there was 1 Brit there. And I remember there was removal people came in, some British guys came in to remove the furniture from the house before the work started. And I gather a bit of an argument resulted when these guys discovered that all the workers on this site were foreigners. Why aren't they being given jobs? Now, this contractor said, and I said, don't you think, what do you think about that? Do you think that's all right? He said, well, I'm not employing them because they're cheap, because I actually pay them the going rate. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. It might be, I don't know. But he said, they're reliable. They don't argue. They don't go off in a huff or something. They don't argue. They turn up at 7 o'clock and they go at 5 o'clock. No, brewing up as soon as they arrive, which I've experienced even in my own house, much to my chagrin. So this is something we've got to address, because if we don't, all these other things are going to come to nothing. So I just wanted to get that saying. How am I right for time?
How much longer have you got?
Well, another 10 minutes.
Okay.
You all right? Yeah. So what are we going to do to help businesses, not just manufacturing industry, but certainly that, but business? Well, we need to make work worthwhile. So the first thing we need to do, and I hope you'll bear with me at times, you might not like what I'm going to say initially, but hopefully you'll appreciate when you hear the whole package of things. I call this a package of reforms. We need to get rid of the job-killing laws. I've always said that certain laws are job-killing, and that when times get difficult, we'll realise it, and we realise it now. Because I think a lot of them are troublemakers' charters. All the anti-discrimination laws, race, gender, sexual orientation. Is there another one I've missed? They're the main ones, aren't they? You can make life very difficult, particularly for small businesses when they've only got a small number of people. You've got one that plays this game here. It can cripple them. Then you've got family-friendly rights and flexible working. I'd abolish that. I'd abolish most employment protection, or I would certainly reform it. At the moment, I think I'm right in saying, if you want to get rid of someone, you have to give 3 written notices. Now, if you're in a small company, small number of people, can you imagine the sort of friction that having to go through this very formal process of giving written notice and what have you? And even then, they can probably go to a tribunal. In fact, they usually do. I would simplify it, require just one written warning. And in most cases, a verbal warning should be enough. But if it's a bit serious, then maybe a written warning is what's necessary. Now, you probably heard a little while ago, when the health service was having problems 2 or 3 years ago about problems on the ward, people said, we've got to bring back matron. That's what we want. Hattie Jakes storming around the wards. Want to bring back matron, bring back a bit of discipline to stop all this nonsense going on. Well, my mum was a matron, actually, in a nurse before I was born. I don't think she was like Hattie Jakes, mind you. I hope not. And but if matron has to walk on eggshells all the time because of all this anti-discrimination nonsense, or she can't sack someone who's blatantly incompetent, not interested in the job or what have you, then you can call her what you bloody well like, but she won't be able to do what matron used to be able to do. People have no authority to manage these days, and I do wonder sometimes where that's one of the reasons why a lot of people get blind drunk on a Friday and Saturday night. We're all walking around on eggshells during at our workplace and what have you. People just go blotto at the weekend. I mean, that's a theory of mine. I'd also get rid of maternity and paternity leave. I don't think it's the job and the job protection that goes with it. Now, you think if you're a small company with 4 people, you could have 2 young girls. If you appoint 2 young girls, they could have a succession of babies. The job could be kept open for them, so you have to get in temporary staff whose heart isn't it because they're only temporary. And then in the end they decide not to come back anyway. You can't run a business like that. I was in a situation 2 years ago when everything was honky-dory because the government had carried on borrowing money, and I had the best trading year I ever had. I did think of employing someone because I was, for once, very busy. But I chose not to because there's no way I would want to put myself through all this. And when we're in the situation now, we want to get new jobs. These are barriers to them. So I'd get rid of that. It's not the job of companies and businesses to subsidise people bringing out families. They've got to have, couples have got to take their own responsibility for bringing out families. The final thing I would get rid of is sick leave. Now, unless you're chronically sick, in which case, the government should look after you. If it might be a few days each year. We're getting enough holiday. Most people get, I think, 4 weeks a year. If you add 2 weeks for Christmas, that's 6 weeks a year. Don't tell me that you can't take some of your sick time off. We are competing with countries that don't have anything like this level of protection. And if we're going to compete with them successfully, we can't afford all this nonsense anymore. So we've got to do that. But here comes the but. So that's the bad side, if you like, because, that's to the disadvantage of the employee. But the minimum wage should be a self-reliant minimum wage for single people, for example, so that it's enough to live on without requiring public subsidy, that you don't need any benefits that these 1/3 of people now have. It should be enough. So it would be quite a bit more than it is now. And then, when people get married or get together and they have children, then you bring in child allowances, which tops up their dual income, which is enough for a family to be self-sufficient. And I would suggest for mum, and I do mean mum, not dad, to be able to look after the kids until they're, say, 5. It should be enough to do that. And it also, in my view, it should only apply to the first 2 children. If you want to have more children than 2, which is going to make our overpopulation even worse, well, do it at your own expense. I don't see why I should do it. So, and in that way, that would cut out a lot of the taxation, because at the moment, we're paying an awful lot of taxation for the government to give certain people back in benefits just to survive. It's a crazy system. It makes us reliant on the government, and it doesn't encourage self-sufficiency. So when the taxation does, any taxation changes should be cost neutral. So what you're saving in tax, what you're spending in tax should not be no more than what we're paying. If there is a saying, as I said before, the first priority should be to lower company taxes, to make our businesses more competitive. Now, it was BNP policy, and I was totally in agreement with it up until recently, that we should remove everyone who's earning less than, I think it started out at 16,000, in the last election we said 12,000. Anyone earning 12,000 or less would pay no tax. Okay, it's a bit like the Liberal. In fact, the Liberal Party probably got it from us, because we were the first to actually suggest it about 8 years ago, I think. I've changed my mind on that, for rather like the reasons I said about why people on benefit should actually pay council tax, because it removes. If you don't pay any tax, again, you've got no incentive not to vote for a profligate Labour government as opposed to a council, because you're going to get this money anyway. But if everyone had to pay tax, and it might start off at 10% and then 20%, different bands, and the amount of money, the minimum wage took that into account, that out of that money you had to pay your 10% tax or what have you, there's another incentive to vote Labour, isn't it? And we need to get that connection back between people's actions and the reactions they get from them. We need to get rid of the compensation culture, which is extremely costly to society as a whole. You might be one of the lucky ones that lands a £300,000 compensation for hurt feelings or what have you. That's got to stop. And again, I think it reduces personal responsibility. People should, not be ready to blame everyone else. And so I would actually bring in a law which says that you can only have compensation for gross or deliberate negligence. That would cut a lot of it out and save us an awful lot of money. Long-term sickness, I won't go into that. Single motherhood, now that's another thing. I'm nearly there now. Single motherhood. I think that's out of control. When I was younger, I think there were very few illegitimate children. And certainly, so I'm talking about single mothers who are deliberately single mothers, 18-year-olds. I dare say you've all probably come across them when those that you canvass, you knock on the door, and down comes this young girl and baby in term, what have you. Oh, I'm from the BNP. What do you think of, the crime around here, or the tax and what have you? Oh, I don't know really. No, I'm all right. Yeah, I'm okay. It takes, I can tell you, I bite my lip to tell them what I really think of them, because there might be a chance we might get a vote from them. Probably won't. And those of you of a certain age will remember the play called Cathy Come Home. Anyone remember Cathy Come Home? That's where it all started. That it was a case of a young mother, illegitimate of an illegitimate child, and how life was very difficult. Which it is. I mean, these things do happen. They're never not going to happen. And after that, single mothers were showered with all sorts of goodies. And of course, we see now the explosion of illegitimacy. Well, it is illegitimacy, they don't call it now. That's single motherhood. And of course, they get the 2-bed flat straight away for 16 years. They get the benefits for all that time. And they go and watch daytime TV all day, and they don't come out for vote cards because they're not really interested, This is extremely costly. And I think it also results in disadvantaged children, because I think we hear horror stories of some of the children from these. They call them broken families, don't they? Broken homes, because they are sort of. It doesn't mean to say they're all like that. We've got to break that vicious cycle. And so I think there should be no free housing. Why should they jump the housing queue? For, you know, a young couple who are waiting patiently to be on the housing, why should they jump it? No. I think the family must provide, the mother must provide, the father must provide. Certainly the father that caused the child must provide. You know, it might be a bit controversial to say this, but I think to break this vicious circle, we've got to do that. And I think if the surrounding family cannot look after the children, or are not interested in looking after the children, then in my view, they would be better off being adopted. That might be harsh to say that, but I think it's true. And it's the only way to break this vicious circle. Young girls have got to, and young men for that matter, have got to realise that it's not a free lunch anymore. You know, if they're not careful what they do, they don't take precautions, that they're not going to get a free lunch anymore. And I think that's the way to stop it. I know it sounds harsh to say it. I think this is the final one, if I'm all right. Education. Yes, education. In about 1880, Otto von Bismarck unified, well, 1870, Otto von Bismarck unified Germany. It used to be 300 little states owned by counts and what have you. He unified it. And one of the things he did in about 10 years' time was to introduce a fully integrated education system. Kindergarten, primary school, secondary school, sort of grammar school and technical schools and university. It was an integrated system, whereas in Britain we drifted along from one, you know, the charities would do a little local school in a village, and we just muddled through. We didn't really get this, any semblance of a system until in the 1944 Education Act. But within that included sort of integrated apprenticeship system. All companies, I think I'm right in saying, in Germany, they have to belong to the local Chamber of Commerce. And unlike our Chamber of Commerces, which are just chatting shops, they actually are responsible for setting the programmes that the technical schools teach, so that, you know, it's not being left up to academics to decide what to teach their apprentices, what have you. It's an obligation on companies to actually provide apprenticeship. It's not an optional extra, they have to do it. And I think you only have to look at the success of Germany for 100 years over us. We were top dogs in 1850, we ruled the world, we produced all the goods and what have you. But I think certainly by 1900, Germany had started to overtake us. And that's one of the main reasons. We need to introduce something similar to that here. So in local schools, secondary schools, we need to get rid of all these Mickey Mouse subjects like media studies and golf studies and all that sort of thing. They must learn the basics that I learnt when I was at school, because that's what they need, that's what will do them good, that's what we need. I also think we should abolish non-Christian faith schools. I think particularly, you have to put it like that, because you can't just say abolish Muslim ones, because they're the ones I'm really concerned with. Because I think we should all be concerned about what's going on in these schools. They're teaching us to hate us. There's been enough evidence of that, but of course no one will do anything about it because they could be accused of racism, won't they? So I think you have to say all non-Christian faith schools. Personally, I would like to see all faith schools go, because I think you've only got to look at Northern Ireland to see the damage that having segregated schools can do. But I'd go along with non-Christian ones. We should abolish this ridiculous 50% target of 50% of youngsters going to university for academic education. It's absolutely absurd. A lot of them are Mickey Mouse degrees anyway, that they're now having to spend a lot of money learning, which will be no good to them when they come out. And so if we reduce that to, I don't know what a figure should be, maybe 30%, 35%, it's whatever the country needs, you know. Then we'd be having to pay less money to subsidise the universities, so we could afford to subsidise the fees a bit more than we are at the moment, so the fees wouldn't be quite so high. I think it's right that students do pay something. I'm lucky, I never had to pay a thing. That's the way it was in those days. I think it's right they should pay something, but not the sort of $9,000 a year they're having to pay now. And then also what I would do is that the government should pay the full cost of fees for what we consider essential subjects for this country, like engineering and science and whatever, the subjects that are going to get this country going, and maths. Those should be free. That would encourage people to go. I think too many skills now have gone academic. We've seen it in nursing. I think we're now realising nursing suddenly went from being a vocation, learnt mainly on the job, to I think 75% in colleges, learning all sorts of academic things they don't really need to learn. You've got the same in the police, So you get, and then now they won't do the bedpans and what have you. So you now have another class of nurse. What do they call them? What do they call them? Auxiliary nurses. That's right. Completely untrained, no standards, what have you. They're doing all the skivvying, which used to be part of, not totally, but used to be part of nurses' jobs. You've got the same in the police. You've got real police, and you've got Blunkett's police. I hope there are none. Sorry, I hope there are none here. But little by little, you can see they've been given more powers, but they don't have the training. They may not have the ability. Same in teaching assistants. Teaching assistants. You're hearing of teaching assistants actually doing teaching more and more now. And I have to say, the same applies for my profession, because in the late 50s. It used to be predominantly an apprenticeship system. You'd join a practice and you'd learn at the boards, as it was then, didn't have computers, and then you go to night school 2 or 3 nights a week, or you might have day releases, that sort of thing. I think it was night school in those days. But then I believe in the late 50s they said no, we're going to go fully academic, so it's 100% academic. And then they separated off the people that did the drawing, who were then called technicians. They used to be called draftsmen, then they were called technicians. But now they feel that's beneath them, so they now call themselves technologists, architectural technologists. They've got a royal institution to go with it. And so no doubt we'll be getting other people to do the dirty work there. So we need to get back to more apprenticeship. In my leadership challenge for the RMBA, reforming architectural education was one of my main platforms, and I wanted to introduce more apprenticeship into it. I think there was a lot of support for the policies I had. There should be compulsory vocational training like the Germans, and also I think we need to license key skills and trades. And that includes construction. And another thing that was in my manifesto was to encourage the government to introduce builders and tradesmen's licensing in this country, to raise building standards. Because I'm sure we've all come across plenty of cowboy builders or suffered from them. So just to sum up, those are the main issues. Just to sum up, sorry if it has been a bit long. Just to sum up, we have very serious problems with our economy and our society. Which I think we've addressed, and by the time we get into power, if we get into power, I think they're going to get worse. We need to address them urgently, and I think doing some of the things I've suggested here will help. But there's one thing I'm still very worried about, and I don't pretend to have an answer for it, and that is, can we turn this country round with a fractured society that we have now, where there's a society that has no cohesion? I honestly don't know the answer to that. But I think we've got to do what we can.